Good day, everybody. We're back by popular demand. Originally, the scope of this webinar was to cover MEP 79 and what had been announced in the last week. But then we've received questions on ETS, EU ETS, and obviously the BIMCO CII clause. We've got a couple of experts in the virtual room here. Stella Spirage from ABS Classification Society, working in the regulatory affairs as a senior engineer, and Helen Barden from North's senior solicitor from North's FD&D department. I'll allow them to introduce themselves as the webinar goes throughout when they come onto their parts. But it's great to have them here, and please feel free to ask them and us any questions throughout the webinar on the chat function. And then we'll aim to have an open session at the end of this, 10 minutes of free-flowing questions. We've already got some questions which have been asked during the registration process, so that's great that we can use them as well if there's no other questions asked during the webinar. So with that, we'll get started on to the next part of the webinar, and I'm just going to give a very high-level overview of what's happened in the past and what's going to be happening in the near future. And then Stella's going to do a deeper dive into that from the ABS Classification Society side of things. And then Helen is going to look into the contractual side of it with Helen's experience from the BIMCO CII drafting clause. And then we're going to follow on the questions from that. Okay, so first of all, let's have a look. What are we looking back at? What's happened recently? So the amendments to the Marpol International Convention for Prevention of Pollution, Marpol Annex 6, entered into force on the 1st of November 2022. Then so we can see here that's what's gone in the past. It's important to remember that this is a rule change now, so it's no longer guidance, it's a rule change, and it's carved out within Marpol. So it's important to remember that and take that on board for the next part. So the next part, as we're looking at here, is the SEEMP. That's the Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plan. The EEXI, which is the Existing Energy Efficiency Index, and the CII, which is the Carbon Intensity Indicator. Now, the Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plan, Part 3, needs to be approved and onboard the vessel by the 1st of January 2023. Stella will elaborate a little bit more on that throughout Stella's part of the presentation, but it's just to make sure that you're all aware that the 1st of January 2023, you need to have the Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plan on board and ready. The EEXI technical file. So EEXI applies to existing ships of 400 gross tons and above, and it'll be required to calculate its attained energy efficiency existing ship index, EEXI, which indicates the energy efficiency effectively. The vessel must then meet a required EEXI, which is based on required reduction factor to reduce its carbon emissions. And the vessel's attained EEXI and technical file is to be verified at the first annual intermediate or renewal survey after the 1st of January 2023. CII reporting, something we'll focus on a little bit as well throughout this webinar. And the first reporting of CII is based on 2023 data retrospectively and is due no later than the 31st of March 2024. That then brings us on to our next slide, which is the CII ratings. And for those of you that are not familiar, a bit like purchasing a washing machine in any continent now, you want to look for the best energy efficiency rating. And it's the same when you're a charterer looking to charter a ship. You want to be looking for the best possible rating, and it's obviously also in the owner's interest to achieve the best possible rating and to make the vessel as marketable as possible, and most importantly, to decarbonize their fleet accordingly. That's the grand aim here, and we need to be careful we don't lose sight of that. So the operational CII rating It's an attained annual operational, and it must be documented and verified against the required annual operational CII to determine the operational intensity rating. And as we can see on these pictures here, we have ratings ranging from A to E, with A being a major superior and rating all the way down to E. Corrective actions and incentives for ships rated at D of 3 consecutive years or rated at E for 1 year must develop a corrective action plan. That's very important to remember, and we'll go on to next the port state control part of this and how that's relevant as well. It's important to note that IMO DCS data is not freely available, but the EU MRV data is freely available. So in other words, the IMO DCS and the actual ratings of each vessel is not publicly available, and that's a question we've been getting from some ship owners, and we're not aware of it being publicly available. And it's something which an owner can keep to themselves, obviously, but a charterer may ask to see that, just as you're purchasing a car, when you ask to see history about the car, it's a similar sort of thing with this when you want to see about a vessel. And it's important to note that there's many different techniques out there to estimate the CII rating of a vessel, and in our experience they seem to be getting more and more accurate as time goes on. So it's important to remember that whilst it's not freely available, it may be quite easy for a charterer to work out roughly what the CII rating is of the vessel before they even contact the ship owners. So that brings us on to our next slide, which basically looks at the port state control guidance. And we've received a number of questions on this, so we think it's important to bring this out now. So an implementation plan needs to be in place, as we've discussed earlier. Now, there's basically been meetings and subcommittees taking place to decide what action is going to be taken for vessels which haven't carried out corrective actions as per their plan, subject to vessels being D and E, and whether it's going to be detainable deficiency, whether it's going to be something where it's going to be a deficiency at all. And there's lots of meetings and discussions taking place on this. A lot of port state controls want to bring this into force. And in my opinion, and this is my opinion on this, I think it would be good to see a system where good ship owners, prudent ship owners who are decarbonising their fleets are, rewarded by such trade, and those that are not complying are suitably measures taken against them. But this is something which is under development. I'm sure you can imagine the problems rolling this out. And the most important thing is rolling this out on an even and fair basis across the world. What we've seen from the sulfur cap IMO 2020, for example, is different port state controls taking different viewpoints on 0.51 and 0.52% fuels, for example, in that marginal non-compliance range. We don't really want to see uneven treatment of ship owners across the globe with this next important phase. So it's important that this gets thrashed out correctly and everything is done properly in that sense. Then we look next as we look at the proposals that are on the table. You can see here that originally against 2008 levels, the proposals are now to reduce a complete phasing out of GHG emissions by 2050. And you can see here as well, the next thing on the horizon is to basically bring in an interim date. I'm sure you're all in agreement here that the distance of time between 2030 and 2050 is quite major. It's 20 years, and quite frankly, we're going through a huge period of development and change. So it would almost be a little bit weak to suggest a 20-year gap. So the proposal is to bring an interim date forward, and that will be applicable from that point. So the next thing is we look at CII correction factors. There's been a lot of news about that lately, and Stella's going to go into that in more detail. The important thing to remember here is that there's more proposals with respect to correction factors for short voyages and port waiting times. Also, power used for cooled and refrigerated cargo, frozen cargo, container vessels and such like. And also correction factors on steam-driven LNG carriers and self-unloading bulk carriers. The important thing to remember, we've received a few questions on this subject, is that, you know, for example, situations of emergency where the master needs to take control of the vessel under SOLAS Chapter 5, or where the vessel is weather routed. In some cases, the actual distance traveled may be beneficial for the owners to keep that in there as opposed to removing the distance traveled. As we go through CII, you'll realize that distance is actually an ally with respect to CII calculations. So it may not be worthwhile subtracting all these distances. And it's something worth discussing with your verifiers. And we encourage strong conversations with your verifiers on this subject. The next points we just want to quickly bring to the attention is carbon capture. I'll put a message into the chat later on, a link that you can look at an article we've written on carbon capture. There's been a lot of development there lately, and we're pleased that we looked into this last year, and we're going to be focused on it again. There's going to be a video to show you some of the carbon capture systems out there. But Stella's going to elaborate on that and what's been changed there as of MEPC 79. Another point we really just want to bring to your attention before handing over is green corridors. Green corridors basically allow policymakers to create an enabling ecosystem with targeted regulatory measures, financial incentives, and safety regulations. And this may lead to regulations and incentives for low-cost green fuel production. Green corridors may help to reduce emissions on other routes, green fuel infrastructure, and some of the work we're doing with IBIA at the moment on infrastructure development on a global basis shows some of the systems being put into place by these green corridors, and it's quite positive progress in our opinion. COP26 is an example of a green corridor, and these are some of the signatories, but we're going to see a lot more of these green corridors as we head into the next period. So that's a very quick canter through from a higher level there. The next part of our presentation, we're going to go into a little bit more detail, and that's going to be Stella then drilling down onto some of the detail from the regulatory perspective. And with that, thank you, Stella. I'm going to hand the floor over to you now, Stella. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. I hope everybody can hear me. I'm facing an issue with the presentation, actually. Okay. So until we are waiting the presentation, let me briefly introduce myself. I'm Stella Spiras. I'm working as a senior engineer in the Regulatory Affairs Department of ABS. Our department interfaces with flag administrations and Ajax, and also we are following up all the regulatory developments internationally in IMO, progressed internationally. And I'm working in the shipping industry for the past almost 8 years, and my background is naval architecture and marine engineering.
Okay, thank you very much, Stella. Are you able to see the presentation at your end, Stella, are you? No. Okay.
No, unfortunately.
Okay, Helen, are you able to see the presentation at your end?
I can see the presentation. Do you want me to take control or?
Well, I can keep control, but I'm just confused. Do you think there's a problem? Thank you, Helen. Do you think there's a problem with your bandwidth at your end, Stella, or not? And I think what we'll have to do then is I'll have to go through the presentation, and you'll have to keep your presentation up in the background. So we'll start off on the first slide, which is MEPC 79 agenda.
Perfect. So the IMO Marine Environment Protection Committee held its 79 session last week from 12 December to 16. and plenty issues were discussed there. The more significant ones were with regards to the IMO greenhouse gas strategy revision. The initial strategy is being revised. This was already foreseen from the initial adoption of the greenhouse gas strategy. We have proposals discussed regarding the marine pollution and energy efficiency of vessels. Also, the ballast water management and marine biosafety items were progressed. And last, marine plastic litter from ships was discussed too. For the scope of our today's discussion, we will focus only to the first part, mostly regarding with respect to the IMO greenhouse gas strategy and the energy efficiency of ships. So going forward to our items, the key greenhouse gas topics included the revision of the initial IMO greenhouse gas strategy, discussions with respect to the 2050 level of ambition, the outcomes of the international working group, intersessional working group on GHG emissions were discussed. The life cycle GHG guidelines of marine fuels also were addressed at this MEPC session, and consideration of market-based measures for low carbon fuels, also including the onboard carbon capture and storage. So all these items were included in the proposals to the 79 MEPC session. And the IMO GHG timeline from 2021 up to 2022 until now, we had the last MEPC 79 in June 2022, where the initiation of the revision of the greenhouse gas strategy started, and this revision is expected to be concluded with within the 80 MEPC session in July 2023. The targets of 2030 and 2050 are still being discussed, along with some additional intermediate checkpoints up to 2050. So during last week discussions, we have the revised ambition of elements with respect to the GHG strategy and further consideration of market-based measures. Of course, we expect all these discussions to be finalized, as I previously mentioned, by MEPC 80. The initial strategy includes targets for 2030 and 2050 with respect to the carbon intensity and GHG emissions. So the target is to reduce by 40% by 2030 the carbon intensity of the vessels compared to the 2080, and by 70% by 2050 in terms of carbon intensity compared to this reference year 2008. Also, in terms of GHG emission absolute reduction, the initial target is to reduce by 2050 by 50% the GHG emissions. Of course, this initial strategy is being revised, and further enhancement to the energy efficiency and carbon intensity have been proposed. Some of them include the carbon intensity of the ship to continue to decline through the implementation of the future phases, and of the future phases of the EEDI for the new ships, and the carbon intensity indicator, the CII, to be reduced by 6 to 7 annually %. So for those who are familiar with the CII, from 2023 up to 2026, we have a 2% reduction of the greenhouse of the CII target, but now it is proposed to increase this percentage to 6, 5 or 7% annually to ensure the 1.5 degrees of Celsius comparative improvement for the CII of ships. So these proposals aim to accelerate the
Stella,
GHG reductions. Yes?
Sorry to interrupt. Could you just try taking control there to see if it works again, please?
Yes, because improvising is a little bit inconvenient.
Is that working now? It is. It's
Now
working.
it is
It's
working.
on. Yeah. Okay.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. So basically, I was trying to introduce this revised the revision of the strategy and the level of ambition. So we are at this slide. And to continue, this discussion include also a revision of additional checkpoint levels for the ambition of the GHG reduction. So along with the 2030 and 2050 checkpoints, now it is being, there are several proposals introducing additional ambitions for 2040. Going forward to the midterm measures, while discussing the development of the revised IMO greenhouse gas strategy to be adopted by MEPC 80, numerous member states expressed support on the implementation of an integrated basket of measures in order to reduce the greenhouse gas strategy. Those measures will implement the earlier short-term measures and will serve to inform and target measures implemented later. So the data that will be collected and the feedback from the industry with respect to the short-term measures will feed the extra target measures that will be implemented for mid-term and long-term. These approaches to the GHG reduction are being considered for inclusion of this basket of short-term measures together with the short-term EEXI and CII, with some voluntary measures already being agreed, so such as the development of national action plans on GHG and global fuel standards to support the uptake of low carbon and zero carbon fuels. Market-based measures implementing a mandatory GHG levy is already being considered. So basically for midterm measures, we have some technical and some revenue-raising concepts to support the industry. So the technical one being discussed is the fuel standard. And the revenue-raising concepts include the emission cap and trade mechanism and zero-emission vessel incentive scheme. So this will reward, let's say, the first movers going to zero emission fuels. So the candidate measures will be concluded by MEPC 80. Another important development is the IMO life cycle guidelines. So the committee received an interim report from the correspondence group on the marine fuel life cycle GHG analysis, which was tasked by MEPC 78. With respect to the development of draft guidelines on the life cycle GHG intensity of marine fuels. At the current stage, the correspondence group made progress in developing a list of main initial fuel production pathways and feedstocks for which they will develop methodologies and allow for calculation of well to tank and tank to wake to finally get the entire well-to-wake GHG emissions default values for the fuel identified. So these developments are important to be followed up to because they give you a better understanding on the fuel use on board of the ship, not only the tank-to-wake emissions, but the entire well-to-wake footprint, GHG footprint of your fuels. So the correspondence group made progress on this development basically of a fuel life cycle label as a technical tool in order to collect and convey information relevant to the life cycle assessments. It was suggested that this tool will be produced by fuel suppliers and delivered to ships with a well-to-tank emission factors and minimum information necessary for the calculation of the tank-to-wake emissions. The correspondence group will continue the work on this development, and similar to the previous slide, these LCA guidelines are expected to be submitted and finalized by MEPC 80. So basically, MEPC 80 is what we are waiting for in order to have a better view on the midterm measures and the life cycle and the revision of the greenhouse gas strategy. Now the onboard carbon capture and storage technologies have progressed and plenty of ship management companies and owners are looking into this technological solution. However, at the current stage, this carbon capture is not reflected to the regulations. So the EEXI, EEXI and CII framework do not include the carbon capture technologies. And that's the reason for the committee receiving several submissions related to the recognition of the onboard carbon capture and storage in relation to the EEXI, EEXI and CII frameworks. So member states recognize the importance of supporting this technological approach to reducing the GHG emissions, and as well and also the importance of considering and accounting the verification and certification of such systems to enable their use and ensure the responsible handling and storage of the carbon capture dioxide. Some delegation highlighted the link with the ongoing correspondence group on the life cycle guidelines and the usage and that the end usage of the carbon capture could be handled by these guidelines, thus they identified the need to postpone this discussion to the correspondence group. And unfortunately, we have no final progress on the carbon capture on board. However, this will be postponed for MEPC 80 in July 2023. Now, with respect to the short-term measures, the committee received several proposals for additional CII correction factors. I know from the industry, plenty of ship managers are looking to the short voyages and port waiting time corrections, and they are waiting for such corrections to be adopted. However, this was postponed to be reviewed at the further at the future point. So even though we had several proposals for correction factors related to the short voyages and port waiting time, this has not been concluded, and we expect better results for MEPC 80. However, the good news is that a few unified interpretations were considered and approved by the MEPC 79. So for ships which are delivered at the end of the calendar year and engaged in the in operation for a short time until the end of the year, the attained CII will be calculated and verified using the available data covering the corresponding period, because there were concerns: what if a vessel is being delivered and we don't have a full set of data in order to assess the attained CII. So clarification on this point was given by this circular, and also some clarifications regarding the statement of compliance, since from 1st January 2023 we'll have the statement of the confirmation of compliance regarding to the SEM Part 3. However, the first statement will not have the CII parts field. this was again clarified. Another clarification was with respect to the change of owner and change of flag. So in case of a change of owner or a flag on or after 1st January 2023, a new SEM Part 3 is to be developed. Now, regarding the revision of EEDI guidelines, the committee adopted Resolution 364 containing the 2022 guidelines of the method of calculating the attained energy efficiency design index for new ships. This update includes the introduction of ethane into the list of fuels, and provides a conversion factor (CF) for the calculation for this calculation. So we have these updated guidelines for the EEDI to be taken into account for new ships, and also guidelines for on the survey and certification of the EEDI were approved. These updates for the certification made reference to the latest version of the IETTC recommended procedure regarding the conduct and evaluation of the speed power trials. So it is noted that the most current version of this standard at the time of sea trials is what will be applicable for each vessel, because there were plenty of issues regarding the definition of the reference speed, so the VREF, and how this is being, the trials are being conducted in order to get the reference speed. So finally, we have some developments on the data collection system. So the committee adopted Resolution MEPC 362 with amendments to the information to be submitted to the data collection system. So the GCS database of the IMO, which is being filled by your verifiers, will include some extra information, such as the year of the vessel delivery, the attained EEDI or attained EEXI as applicable. For ships which apply to the CII regulation, the AER or the CGDIST CII measure will be reported to the required operational CII, the attained operational CII before any correction, and attained annual operational CII. Also, the operational carbon intensity rating will be stated here in the IMO DCS database. If I could recommend to the ship management companies, as soon as the DCS and the CII is being reported to the GCS database, you can ask your verifiers for a data extract of the information being submitted there, in order to have this information available to your end, because this might be helpful for other schemes like the Poseidon principles that you can use, and also this will give you, let's say, an extra control of checking whether the information being submitted from you to the verifiers and from the verifiers to the IMO DCS database is in line, because in MEPC 79 also it was highlighted to the committee that still, even though we have the third reporting period with the IMO DCS, there are plenty errors highlighted in the database, such as unrealistic time spent at sea, which is more than a year. So in order to minimize, let's say, this bad quality data, you can ask for an extract of your DCS submitted information. that of course will include the CII rating. And this is linked to what Mark previously mentioned, because even though this database is anonymized and it's not publicly available, other schemes such as the Poseidon Principle might request the rating of your vessels, and they may have an overview, or even charterers themselves. So that was all from my side. I will pass the floor to Helen, and I hope I did not, I made this clear, these few points into this 10-15 minutes.
Thanks very much, Stella. And thanks, Mark, as well. So I'm Helen Barden, a senior solicitor in North's FD&D team in Newcastle. And I've obviously been doing these webinars with Mark for a while now, but as you mentioned, we've had quite a few inquiries in about the recently published BIMCO CII clause. So as I was on the drafting committee for that clause, I'm obviously a helpful person to be on this presentation, hopefully. So I'll shortly go on to that clause, which I appreciate is quite long and complicated. So hopefully this will sort of clarify some of the points for you. It's also sort of fair to say that there are critics of the CII regulations, both from owners and charterers. But obviously it's hoped that ultimately it will lead to a reduction in emissions, which we all know is absolutely vital to meeting these IMO targets, and will become even more vital if the targets actually do become even stricter. There are obviously oddities with the CII regime, such that, say, long ballast voyages are beneficial for CII calculations, and discussions about whether the AER formula is actually the formula that should be used. But I think there's probably always going to be pros and cons to whichever formula gets used. And hopefully in time, as perhaps more correction factors come out, those criticisms will reduce. And I think what's really important is to sort of bear in mind that this is a regulation that's aimed at reducing the operational emissions, and is a mechanism to achieve the IMO objectives of decarbonisation. So hopefully with owners and charterers working together with that aim in mind, that's where we'll get to. There's obviously the commercial considerations as well for both owners and charterers when it comes to, for example, contracting parties wanting to contract with those with greener credentials. So that's, you know, it's looked at from the sort of commercial side as well. At present, for breaching the CII regulations, the enforcement position isn't particularly clear, although, as Mark mentioned earlier, there is this MEPC subcommittee that is looking at detainable deficiencies. The regulations also recommend incentives for A and B rated ships, but I think in the early days, the main concern for non-compliance is probably more of a commercial one. For example, that there might be a two-tier market that appears for better rated and poorer rated ships. So I'll now go on to the clause. I put a link in the chat to the CII clause on the BIMCO website, just in case you want to kind of have that alongside while I give this presentation. So existed unamended time charter parties are not set up to deal with the CII regulations, which is why BIMCO was, you know, obviously has drafted this BIMCO CII Operations Clause. The CII regulations, by their very nature, impose restrictions on a vessel's operation. At the heart of this clause is the need for both the owners and charterers to collaborate and operate in a transparent way. And the idea is that it will allow flexibility between the parties. The clause appreciates not just the role that charterers play when it comes to operation of the ship, as regards employment and voyage orders, but also the role that owners play as regards to maintenance as well. It's a standalone clause, but it does require the parties to actually sort of understand the clause and what they've agreed to, and also understand the CII regulations. This clause isn't a compliance clause, so compliance by the parties with this clause won't necessarily lead to compliance by owners with the CII regulations, although obviously it's hoped that it will assist owners in getting to that point. So that's something to bear in mind. There are quite a few definitions in this clause, and I'll generally touch on them as I go through. But I think it's probably worth highlighting a couple of them just now, which is sort of a couple of the key definitions. So just taking a step back with the CII being the operational efficiency indicator and using the AER formula, which provides a figure in grams of CO2 per deadweight nautical mile. And then that figure will have an equivalent CII rating. So for the purpose of the required CII, that being the CII, that the value that the ship needs to achieve, the equivalent value will be a midpoint of a C rating. So when drafting the clause, we kept the CII values as being grams of CO2 per deadweight nautical mile for consistency, and hopefully as a way of it being more accurate for the parties to keep track of the vessel's CII compliance during the calendar year. So the definition of agreed CII means the values, as I mentioned, in grams of CO2 per deadweight nautical mile, and they are filled out in subclause D. And this is a figure that the parties are supposed to discuss and agree upon. Because there are likely to be some unexpected events that can impact the vessel's CII rating, for example, unpredicted port stays or adverse weather, it's beneficial for the agreed CII not to be at the sort of lower CII rating end, so not sort of C bordering on a D, for example, but more comfortably within the C range. And that agreed CII is the yardstick against which the CP attained CII, another definition, is measured. So the CP attained CII also is a value in grams of CO2 per deadweight nautical mile, and that's as attained by the vessel applying any regulatory correction factors and voyage adjustments applicable to the vessel, but also excluding fuel consumed and distance travelled during off-hire periods as set out in the clause. If that definition is left blank, or if there's a 0 put in that definition, then all fuel consumed and distance travelled during off-hire periods will be excluded from that CP attained CII calculation. However, the parties might agree, for example, that only off-hire periods in excess of, say, 10 accumulated days will be excluded from the calculation, and in those circumstances, a 10 would be added to the definition where it's provided for. So that's something for the parties to consider. So moving on to the actual subclauses, the subclause A is really to encourage the parties to familiarise themselves with the requirements of the CII regulations. The definition of Marpol carbon intensity regulations under the clause includes the vessel's ship energy efficiency management plan, so the SEMP, which the ship obviously has to follow. And it's recommended really that charterers ask for a copy of the SEMP, because that will include the ship's implementation plan, so the way in which owners are going to achieve CII compliance. So that's something that would be helpful for charterers to see. And in addition, I think the SEMP in coming years will also have the prior year's CII rating in there as well. As I mentioned at the start, a really important part of making CII compliance work is going to be cooperation, collaboration, and transparency between the parties. And that's really what subclause B is about. Moving on to subclause C, as I mentioned earlier, the agreed CII is that yardstick against which the CP attained CII is going to be measured. So in this subclause, the charterers are agreeing not to allow that CP attained CII exceeding the agreed CII. So to achieve that obligation, it's obviously going to mean that it can't be business as usual, because employment orders and sailing directions are going to have a direct and significant impact upon a ship's carbon intensity. So charterers and owners are obviously going to need to monitor that CP attained CII on an ongoing basis. I think there's a couple of points that are worth flagging. So if as a charterer you've got a ship on charter for only part of a calendar year, because the CP attained CII is measured only for the period that you have the ship on charter, you're not automatically having to kind of make up for, say, a previous charterer's failings. I know there's been a concern amongst charterers that that's going to be an expectation from owners' side. But as I mentioned, the yardstick against which charterers are going to be measured is that agreed CII, and that's the figure that the parties need to negotiate and agree upon. So that's the key really from the charterer's side. Also, the obligation for the CP attained CII not to exceed the agreed CII is measured at the end of the calendar year or at the time of redelivery if that's before the end of the calendar year. So it allows that flexibility during the charter period, so that if, for example, charterers want to take on a more carbon intensive voyage, that might be okay, as long as you then plan for a less carbon intensive voyage to sort of bring the CP attained CII back in line with that agreed CII trajectory. The subclause C also sort of clarifies or expressly states that the existing warranties in the charter party remain, so that, for example, if there is a breach by owners of the speed and consumption warranty, then charterers still have their usual rights of recourse as regards such a breach. Turning to subclause D, I've already explained the agreed CII definition, and that's where this gets set out. So there's a table and that's populated for each year, and the agreed CII is included. As a safeguard, in case the table isn't populated, although as I mentioned, it's really for the parties to understand what they've agreed upon and include, populate that table themselves. If it isn't populated, then the default position is a CII value of an equivalent to the required CII, so the midpoint C rating. Also, to try and future-proof the clause, because at this stage the CII regulations only have the year-on-year reductions up to 2026. If the CP extends beyond 31st of December 2026, the parties are to review and populate the clause in line with any revisions to the regulations. And finally, just to mention, under this clause, subclause, the owners are to provide charterers with the delivery attained CII, so that's another definition, and that is the vessel's attained CII from the start of the calendar year up to the point at which the vessel is delivered to the charterers. And that's because that delivery attained CII might actually be more useful to the charterers perhaps than the CII rating that the ship has at that time, given that the CII rating is for the previous calendar year, whereas the delivery attained CII is actually how the ship has performed up to that point during the calendar year. Moving to subclause E, because the operating speed of the ship is likely to directly and significantly contribute to the carbon intensity of a ship, and slow steaming at this stage is obviously seen as being a sort of main means of achieving CII compliance. The intention behind this clause is to give charterers that flexibility to order the vessel to slow steam. Subclause F sets out owners' obligations, which are important obligations insofar as minimising fuel consumption and maintaining a ship's energy efficiency are concerned. And then subclause G goes on to set out what on the face of it, I think, is probably the clause that is or has caused most concern for charterers, because of the fact that it is seen as being an interference with their rights as regards employment of the ship. But I think what's really important to bear in mind with this subclause is that this is only going to be used where charterers aren't complying with their obligations up to that point. As I mentioned, the sort of heart of this clause is this need for the parties to cooperate and have transparency between them. So it's hoped that if that is, that is undertaken by both parties, then this clause won't need to be invoked. But even if this clause does need to be invoked, then the underlying objective is to promote that sort of ongoing constructive dialogue between the parties to get the ship's CII trajectory back on track. Moving to subclauses, the last sort of three subclauses. Subclause H, this subclause clarifies that the steps taken to comply with charterers' orders or to comply with a written plan doesn't place owners in breach of any of the charter party terms. And subclause I, as I mentioned when looking at subclause E, there is this right to obviously slow steam, and there may be orders that charterers give to bring the vessel CP attained CII back in line with the agreed CII. So this clause stipulates that charterers are to ensure that contracts of carriage issued by or on behalf of the owners provide that compliance with this clause or with these orders won't be a breach. So, and then there's a sort of indemnification provision. So the wording sort of mirrors provisions such as the BIMCO slow steaming clause. It's therefore really important for charterers to ensure that an appropriate liberties clause is included in bills of lading. I'm just going to pick up on this question that's come in from Francis. Could you explain why possibly only some off-hire periods may be agreed to be excluded? The reason behind that is because it was seen to, I guess, be more balanced if some off-hire periods or all off-hire periods were excluded. My general understanding from sort of the more technical people that I've spoken to is that actually probably sort of smaller amounts of off-hire periods won't really affect a vessel's CII rating, perhaps only if it's on the sort of margins of, say, close to the D rating, if the vessel's on a C rating. That might be when it actually could impact upon whether the vessel is compliant or not. So that's the reason why there was a sort of view that actually you could probably have a certain number of off-hire days, which wouldn't then actually really impact upon the CII calculation. But obviously from a charterer's perspective, when they don't have, they haven't actually got the employment of the ship in the off-hire periods, there was a concern that actually those periods should be excluded, and perhaps if actually it's not really going to make much difference to CII compliance anyway, then why shouldn't they be excluded? So that's a point for commercial sort of negotiation between owners and charterers. And then just coming back to subclause J, this clause stipulates the right for owners to claim damages for charterers' breach of contract, albeit the owners obviously have to evidence any damages that have been caused. I've obviously rattled through that clause a bit, and I'm conscious there's only 5 minutes remaining. I was going to just briefly mention the where we are with the EU ETS, because we've had quite a few questions on that. Following the trilogue discussions between the EU institutions, there was an official statement on the EU Council's website 2 days ago stating that a proposal had been agreed between the institutions. They have agreed on a gradual introduction of obligations for shipping companies to surrender allowances, 40% for verified emissions from 2024, 70% for 2025 and 100% for 2026. Most large vessels will be included. There is a distinction for large offshore vessels of over 5,000 gross tonnage, which will be included in the MRV regulation from 2025 and in the EU ETS from 2027. There are also general cargo vessels and offshore vessels between 400 and 5,000 gross tonnage will be included in the MRV regulation from 2025, and their inclusion in the EU ETS will be reviewed in 2026. There's also been an agreement for non-CO2 emissions, methane and nitrous oxide, to be included in the MRV regulation from 2024 and in the EU ETS from 2026. So those are a couple of the points that have come out of this proposal. It goes on to say that this agreement that's been reached does need formal endorsement from both institutions, and then it'll be adopted in legislation and enter into force. So obviously we're waiting for that final text, but I think for owners and charterers who have been worried about shipping suddenly being included in 2023, that looks extremely unlikely now, that this proposal for a sort of an agreed phased-in approach from 2024 seems to be where we're at. Obviously, for owners entering into charter parties that might span 2024, then there needs to be an appropriate clause in that, and there is the BIMCO ETSA clause for Time Charterparties 2022, which could be considered. And I will stop talking so that we can go to some of these questions.
Just while you're looking at those questions, Helen, I just want to add something to the points you raised. Are excellent in response to Francis' question, but just to notify you there, Francis, something that we've been discussing recently is that in some cases, just like when commercial off-hire between a ship owner and charterer, sometimes when it's less than an hour, it's classed as, the paperwork and submissions almost outweigh the gains received. But also to that effect, as we touched on slightly earlier, the distance of the vessel, you may not want to subtract that from your calculations, because the distance traveled by the vessel might actually work in your favor from a CII calculation perspective. So all of this needs to be taken into consideration with respect to off-hire periods and what is actually brought forward from that. So I just thought I'd raise that point while Helen's having a look at the other questions. Thank you, Helen. Thanks.
Thanks. There's the message from a question from Richard. Could you please explain why guarantees on the performance of the ship regarding its speed consumption is not included in the clause? So in terms of the speed and consumption position, this was, heavily discussed in the drafting committee and how that should be dealt with. But there was a view that there wouldn't be, say, a right for charterers not to comply with their obligations under the clause in circumstances where the vessel is underperforming. As I'm sure you're probably aware, in terms of speed and consumption claims, they can be very difficult to evidence, and there are also a lot of differences when it comes to how interpretations are given to, say, the good weather definition. So it was thought that to try and even sort of on a de minimis basis, or sort of provide some sort of figure that if the vessel is underperforming above a certain amount, then charterers' compliance wouldn't have, they wouldn't need to comply. And any of those discussions, I think, would just make the work, this clause very difficult to work around. So that was why they weren't sort of completely carved out. So charterers do still need to comply with their obligations under the clause, even if there is a breach by owners of the performance warranties. But And whilst sort of within the drafting originally, we didn't actually have this express wording that the speed and consumption warranties remained, on the basis that our view was that they, if they're elsewhere in the Charter Party, they will still remain. It was then agreed to put this express wording in the clause so that it's absolutely clear to charterers that you do still have a right to claim from owners where there is a breach of the speed and consumption warranty. So that was the sort of balance that was drawn, I suppose, in the end. There is another question. Will there be any incentive for charterers to comply with the BIMCO CII clause or similar to attain the agreed CII from owners or other parties in the future? The original clause seems more liable to charterers than to owners. I suppose that question sort of goes to the heart of the regulations. We've obviously got the EEXI regulations, which is for the technical side of the ship, and then these CII regulations, which are for the operational side of the ship. And I think when it comes to the operation of the ship, excuse me, a large part of that does rest with the charterers. So whilst the regulations sit on the owner's shoulders, that's really because that's the sort of easier target from a regulatory perspective. But when you're looking at the operation, there's not really a way of avoiding this need to pass that, a large part of compliance down to charterers, certainly as regards the employment and voyage orders. The clause, as I mentioned earlier, does make clear that the maintenance side rests with the owners, which then obviously feeds into compliance with speed and consumption warranties. If the ship's properly maintained, they should be, the owners should be capable of meeting those warranties. So whilst it may on the face of it seem that there's more obligation onto the charterers, really that's a reflection of the regulations rather than, I suppose, a reflection of the clause, in my view. Mark, I'm conscious that we're past 9 o'clock. I don't know if you want me to carry.
If you're happy to keep on going, Helen. I mean, there's still 129 people present, so if you're happy to carry on, then please do.
Okay. Another question: how is the cost that shall incur to improve CII rating through performance modification alterations can be resolved through the BIMCO clause? There isn't provision within the clause for any modifications to be addressed. I suppose if that's something that owners and charterers want to look at, that would have to be agreed separately. As I mentioned, this is sort of the operational side rather than the technical modification side of the IMO regulations. When the vessel is staying a long period at anchorage, this deteriorates the rating, then what charterers' orders can be for ameliorising this? So yes, that's absolutely right. There obviously is these longer periods that can impact upon the vessel's CII rating. And as Mark and Stella have mentioned, whether waiting times are going to be looked at or are going to be addressed through correction factors just remains to be seen. At the moment, there isn't a correction factor for that, so it will